to subrecipient monitoring, but that's extremely important with everything that we do. If it's not documented, when we're reviewed by whoever the reviewers are, federal, state, or whoever, if it's not documented, it's not done. So our documentation throughout everything that we do is very important. Next. All right, so why are we doing this? What are the requirements? Well, it's by law. And if you have not heard the reference to 2 CFR 200, I'm sure you have by now, but just in case you haven't, that's our main point of reference. That's the federal regulation that guides the work that we do. And I would certainly recommend that we get acquainted with it, and even more acquainted than we've ever been before. And specifically, as we talk about subrecipient monitoring, in 2 CFR 200, the sections that are most relevant to what we're talking about today and what we will do with subrecipient monitoring are 200.331 and section 332. 331 speaks to subrecipient and contractor determinations, and 332 requirements for pass-through entities. Our discussion today will be more centered around 332, and 331 is quite important, and it impacts the work that we do in 332. But we'll have other times to talk a bit more about determinations. It'll come up in our discussion today, but not in great detail. Next slide. Okay, so if we look at the law, the regulation, OMB under the uniform guidance spells out what's expected of us. It gives the specifics, the expectations, and the requirement is for the work that's expected of pass-through entities. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And the expectation is that pass-through entities are required to do the following. Next slide. And that is, and that's us, pass-through entities, evaluate each subrecipient's risk for non-compliant, to determine the appropriate level of monitoring to apply to each subrecipient. Monitor the activities of subrecipient organizations to help ensure that subawards follow the federal statutes and regulations and the terms of the subaward. And thirdly, verify that subrecipients are audited as required by subpart F of the uniform guidance. Next slide. So specifically, or to restate that in an abbreviated or simplified form, there are 3 things that are required. 1 is to perform risk assessments. 2, monitor for compliance with regulations. And 3, verify that subrecipients are audited. Next slide. All right, so as we move forward in doing this, and again, we will not cover all the how-tos, of course, today, but you can expect to receive a tool that will be called the Subrecipient Monitoring Procedures Handbook. That will be coming out very shortly. And I'm not just saying shortly, but very, very shortly. And that handbook opens with the statement. They sort of speaks to, with those general regulations that I talked about, it brings it home to us. State of North Carolina and its administering agencies are direct recipients of State Fiscal Recovery Funds under the American Rescue Plan Act, and we are required to provide evidence of due diligence in assessing each subrecipient's capabilities, their processes, both capabilities and processes that are required to meet the objectives of the subaward and to account for the use of the funds. Okay, next slide. And here to make that a little clearer, let's go through some definitions. I've mentioned a few things in that we want to clarify a bit. I mentioned that the state of North Carolina and its administering agencies are responsible. Let's define what administering agencies are. That's us. That's you. That's prime recipients or pass-through entities. And under the regulations, administering agencies are required to manage and monitor their subrecipients to assess their compliance with the requirements, and pass-through entities are defined as non-federal entities that are sometimes referred to as prime recipients or lead organizations, or more specifically, as the funding flows from the federal government, the funding flows directly to the recipient, to the prime recipient. And the way that we're structured, the way that we're organized, each state agency is considered an administering agency or prime recipient. Next slide. What's a subrecipient? Well, subrecipients are entities that receive the subawards from the prime recipients, or you may call us pass-through or administering agencies. But subrecipients receive that money, and the subrecipients operate under an agreement or contract with the recipient to carry out a specified project or the activity. Next slide. And then there's monitoring. Monitoring should be considered as an ongoing process. And I'll emphasize that it's it's not a one-shot deal. It's not done once a year or whatever. It should be considered as an ongoing process, and with that process, it's our responsibility to assess the quality of the subrecipient's performance over a period of time. Monitoring provides information about program participants that's critical in making judgments about the program's effectiveness and that program's management or the management of that program, their efficiency in doing so. Now, monitoring that we are expected to do with these grant funds is not considered to be a gotcha exercise. We don't even call it an audit. It's called monitoring. However, we have responsibilities in looking to ensure that there's good performance, there's good quality, there's efficiency and effectiveness. But monitoring also may disclose situations where there's fraud, waste, abuse, and we certainly do not want any of that to occur. And if we should encounter that, we should be prepared to handle that appropriately. Next slide. Monitoring is also an opportunity. Monitoring is an opportunity for us to provide technical assistance to our subrecipients. It's an opportunity for us to build and strengthen collaborative relationships. It's an opportunity for all of us to understand the business. the business of the subrecipient, and to do a better job of understanding the business that we're trying to, how do I say, implement or enhance those operations. So along those lines as well, as we strengthen those partnerships with the subrecipients and we understand the business, we are in a position to enhance the outcomes of the program. Next slide. There are different types of monitoring. There's administrative and financial monitoring. That's making sure that subrecipients are implementing and managing, tracking along appropriately. And that means that the monitoring in that case has a financial flavor, if you will, in that we want to make sure the accounting and the record keeping is done properly. There's a good tracking of funds, and there's all of the compliance with all of the regulations. We're making sure that there's compliance with federal and state regulation. There's also monitoring, which will be important with the broad and vast types of funding that we're doing under this program. There's program monitoring and there's project monitoring. This type of monitoring is done to make sure that there is efficient work being done to come to those performance outcomes that we desire, and to make sure that these projects are, being brought on board following all regulations that are expected. So there are different types of monitoring, and obviously the monitoring that we're focusing on as we speak here now is more with the administrative and the financial monitoring. Next slide. But as we talk about this, let me emphasize and reemphasize again as we get ready to talk a little bit more about what we're going to do, is that we got to make sure we document this. It's of great importance that we emphasize the documentation. Now, before we get into some of the kind of high level on some of the steps that we will go into, let me just kind of mention a few to-dos that come along with, next slide, please, Andy, that kind of come along with the monitoring. There are certain roles, responsibilities, to-do items, I would say, that we need to be aware of as we approach subrecipient monitoring and as we prepare to receive the funds, whether we are doing direct spending or if we're monitoring our subrecipients. Next slide. And some of that includes, well, some of what we're kind of talking about today. We're not specifically doing it, but it is important that each organization makes sure that they receive sufficient training in this area. NCPRO is preparing to do some things to brush up on understanding subrecipient monitoring, preparing to do subrecipient monitoring, and also to give technical advice. It is urgent that each agency make sure that there is sufficient training, and that means training for the agency as well as it's with this partnership, maybe even some training with your subrecipients. We will need to talk more about, and I'm sure you've been thinking about, the fact that there are differences in subrecipients, beneficiaries, and contractors as to how they are managed, how the funding flows, and specifically with what we're talking about today, the requirements of monitoring. Subrecipients, we have to do monitoring of funds that go to subrecipients. Subrecipient monitoring is not required with beneficiaries and with contractors. So it's important to make that distinction so we make sure that in those areas where we are required to do the monitoring, that we do it. Okay, that's an area that I mentioned that because it is one that becomes a little can become tricky. We want to be aware of it, but this is not the session that we plan to talk about the specifics of that. As we get set up, there are some things that, you know, some of the rubber meets the road things that we need to make sure we get entities set up in the system and so forth. Need to make sure that we get those UEI numbers, and I understand that there are some complications that some are experiencing in getting that, and we'll work with you on that, and we can get things set up with the taxpayer ID number if necessary. As we prepare ourselves and as we get subrecipients set up or qualified, if you will, we need to go through those exercises and ensuring that we check for debarment and suspension, and that's both on federal and state listings, making sure that we do in fact execute memorandums of understanding. That will be a state agency responsibility with your subrecipients. As we go forward, making sure we have our budgets set up so that we plan and budget how the money is going to be used. And there's also a requirement that we get our hands on the budgets that are established by our subrecipients that show how they plan to spend the money. Getting our hands on the subrecipients' financial reports, organizational charts, their policies and procedures. All of these things are important to get our hands on and to understand very well because they will aid us in our subrecipient monitoring. Okay, let's move to the next slide. And we'll move to the first, I would say, determinant of where we go with our subrecipient monitoring. The risk assessment, if you remember on one of the earlier slides, is that we have to do some evaluation. And the risk assessment is the means by which we do that evaluation, and it also has a great bearing on how we do our subrecipient monitoring. A risk assessment is a way to evaluate potential financial and compliance risk of a subrecipient. There are several factors that need to be considered when determining the level of risk of a subrecipient, and these risk assessments help us to understand that, and it dictates the monitoring plans that we establish. So before you can plan to actually do the subrecipient monitoring, the risk assessment is the first and very important step in the process. Next slide. Risk assessments. At a minimum, administering agencies should perform the following to determine a risk rating. When we do these risk assessments, we want to come out with a rating of how risky, and by category, what level of risk a subrecipient may be graded as, if you will. And there are different things that we want to take a look at that will aid in making those assessments. We want to get our hands on any previous single audits that have been done, whether it be single audits or any other audit reports that they may have. Any previous financial or programmatic performance data that may be available. It's important with these risk assessments that we get an understanding of the subrecipients' previous management of grants and grant awards. How much have they done? The adequacy of their personnel, the skill level in managing grant funds. You know, that some of that will be a subjective judgment, but much of it will be based on the experience in actually managing grant awards. Make an assessment of their policies, their procedures, and their systems. Are they operating with new systems, older systems? Do they have systems at all? Or are they automated? Or are they manual? Or do they seem to have comprehensive written policies and procedures? Now, so I'm mentioning some things, but in the NCPRO manual that you'll get on the subrecipient monitoring, there will be a listing of items that you can use, items that you need to make the assessment. And in using those, there also is in that manual a risk assessment scorecard for your subrecipients, so that using this information, you should come out with risk assessment ratings. Next slide. And we're going to recommend that there are 3 buckets of risk assessment that you come away with. There's a low risk, medium risk, and high risk. Next slide. And with those ratings are going to determine the type of monitoring that you do. If it's low risk, you will do accountability calls and reporting reviews. Accountability calls, we're going to recommend that that's done with all of your subrecipients, regardless of the risk level. Accountability calls, as the name implies, we stay in touch. You know, if there's low risk, we stay in touch as a way of monitoring. But as the risk level goes up, we want to add to those accountability calls and do additional work. Low risk accountability calls and reporting reviews. If there's medium risk, the accountability calls and desk reviews. Desk reviews meaning that, you know, it can be done virtually, or it can be done right there in your office individually, but by obtaining records from your subrecipient, and that review is done in your office. Review of records remotely. But if it's high risk, the expectation is accountability calls and on-site monitoring visits. Now, this, of course, is the standard, and that's something that we'll have to visit and revisit how we do that, depending on how we do with this pandemic. But in summary, the higher the risk, the higher the audit risk, monitoring levels change accordingly. And this we must do to make sure that we're in compliance with the federal laws. Next slide. So, risk assessments. With these risk assessments, we as administering agencies shall conduct annual reviews of each subrecipient. Now, that annual review will differ depending on the the type of assessment or the type of rating that subrecipient receives. If it's a high risk subrecipient, that annual review is going to be, well, and as I say, these annual reviews, that's in addition to your ongoing monitoring. But there is to be an annual review that's on site, or a desk review, or the sampling reviews. And I probably should have put it on the slide, but as I mentioned, the documenting the along the way, as we make these decisions on the type of monitoring, the level of risk and so forth, that should result in a documented monitoring plan. So once you decide on what the risk level is, what type of monitoring you're doing with your subrecipients, that there should be a documented monitoring plan. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what we've made the determination as to the risk level, what our monitoring plan is, depending on the risk level, and now we want to get into the actual monitoring. And this is where your handbook comes into play. In that handbook, there will be procedures that speak in more detail as to the how-tos of monitoring. It's going to list for you items that you need to review to do the monitoring. There will be checklists and step-by-step guides that are included in there, and other references that will be of help to you. Next slide. And in performing this monitoring, let me just mention a few things that are must-do activities. We must monitor subrecipient activities to make sure that the funds are used only for authorized purposes, that there is compliance with requirements, and there's performance goal achievement. Monitoring must include reviewing the required financial and performance reports, ensuring that if there are any deficiencies that are noted, that there are corrective actions that are taken. And again, with the documentation, there should be documented results of your work, and documenting what the agreed upon management decisions are for addressing audit findings. Or I shouldn't say audit findings. Well, audit findings as it relates to the single audit work, but findings also that may come out of your monitoring work. Next slide. We must, while this is not considered an audit or an enforcement type of activity, we must be prepared, however, if we do encounter any non-compliant situations. And there certainly is that potential, or possibility, I should say. And there are enforcement actions that, much of this certainly before we do any of these types of things, there's within your own organization, this should move up your management chain. This should be shared with NCPRO, should be shared with our legal folks and so forth if necessary. But also there are certain activities that have to be referred to the federal government, the Office of the Inspector General, if there's any enforcement action that's necessary. Next slide. Just want to mention a few other things to keep in mind as we do this monitoring. We've sort of talked through some of the requirements, the risk assessments, the information that you need to get your hands on, where you will find the guides that will help you with the monitoring, the importance of getting the training and so forth. But let me just mention a couple other examples of things that we want you to be aware of and to put on your to-do list as you prepare to monitor. And we move to the next slide. You should have this in your memorandums of agreement with your subrecipients, but I'll just emphasize that it is important that you ensure that you have access, and the subrecipient knows that access to their financial records is a requirement. We must have access to any records that we need. We will have an acknowledgement of a receipt of reward form, now award for form that we will ask to get signed. Of course, the MOU is going to be signed, but there's a specific document that we're wanting to get signed that acknowledges receipt of these instructions and the expectations and so forth. Now, we want to make sure, as we've alluded to, that if there are any instances of non-compliance that are noted during the monitoring, that prompt action is necessary. Don't sit on it. Run it up your organization so that they are aware of any concerns, whether it's financial or performance or anything. The communication is extremely important as we partner with the subrecipients and as we work together within the administering agencies and your communication with NCPRO. So communicate with subrecipients on a regular basis with these accountability calls. Document and retain your communications regarding the performance as we go along the way. And again, report any significant issues to NCPRO. Next slide. And again, the importance of documenting. You may get tired of hearing us say that, but you will hear us say it, and we're emphasizing it within NCPRO as well, the importance of documenting everything that we do. We are dealing with some significant funding, some significant issues, some high-profile matters that we are responsible for, and it's essential that we keep good and accurate records. I know we didn't get into the real nitty-gritty of a lot, and actually I went a little longer in time than I had intended there, but if you have any questions, we'll try to answer those now, and any that we can't answer right now, we'll be sure to get the answers for you. And please do feel free to contact us, and any issues as your front line of communication and reporting back to NCPRO. Your contact point is your grant specialist, your grant manager. So if you have any issues, make sure that there's a good communication established there. So I'm going to open it up for questions, and also I think we're still going to have our time after the close of this meeting where we'll have some office hours if you want to save your questions for then. I think I'll throw it back to you, Andy.
We have a question here, Benny. Do you have to monitor contractors?
The answer to that is no. We don't have to monitor beneficiaries or contractors, and that's where those definitions really are very important. I just mentioned kind of briefly when we're talking subrecipients. Subrecipients are, I guess you may say, an extension of our work in that subrecipients are by definition expected to carry out a portion of or carry out the activities being responsible for the implementation of the activities in the award. When it comes to beneficiaries, we don't monitor them because they are not assigned that responsibility of carrying out the award. The money is given to them to spend for the whatever assigned purposes they are, but not the purpose of executing the award. And similarly with the contractors, you, as whether it's us or whether it's a subrecipient, with a contractor, there's an agreement to provide goods and services, but not for them to execute the program. So we are not required to do monitoring of them. But, you know, I don't want to get too far afield here, but there are certain requirements that that even with our contractors, when it comes to procurement activities and so forth, that are responsibilities that have to be met. Yet on the screen now, you see some of the definitions with subrecipients, beneficiaries, contractors, and I'll let you take a look at that. I think I've kind of spoken to that, but these distinctions are very important because they impact the monitoring requirements and other activities that we're required to do as well. Okay. Any other questions? If none, thanks for your time. And we are available to provide assistance. We try to give more of an overview today, what it is and why it's important and how we're going to go about doing it, but we will make ourselves, NCPRO will be available to do what we're supposed to do in providing more specific technical assistance when questions arise. But I'll emphasize two other things. One is the training that you would be expected to for your folks to have that are doing the subrecipient monitoring. We would certainly be welcome. I'm sure I'm kind of speaking for our grants folks, but as they are arranging training, maybe we can do a little piggyback in here and you can be a part of that. But also anticipate the manual coming out that should provide some more specific details for you to follow. Thank you.
Thanks, Benny. We will move in sort of the last part of the agenda here. I'll talk about some next steps. As Lee mentioned up top, we are making some calendar adjustments. So we're planning to meet with you all again this time next week, and the focus of that conversation will be on reporting. I know we did a kind of a high-level overview a few weeks back, but we want to walk through more of the specifics on how we are implementing the requirements that we need to keep up with at NCPRO on behalf of the state, and what that means for you all as the administering agencies. So plan on that conversation next week, and if there are folks, other people on your teams who are going to be involved with financial and/or programmatic reporting, please be sure to include them for the invite. We also have just noted here we're going to meet again on the 30th and then the 14th. So we're kind of restarting that biweekly schedule next week, so we can sidestep the July 4th holiday week as well. Jumping back up to the top of the slide here, our accounting and finance team wanted to make sure that you all know that SFRF payment requests for the current fiscal year must be submitted by 3 p.m. on Friday, June 24th. If you submit after that, you'll still get your money, but it'll just push into early July for that to process as we prepare for the switchover of fiscal years. And then finally, we have restarted the school government learning community meetings. We had a good conversation this week, and the next two are going to be July 13th and then August 17th, both at 1 p.m. So if you are interested, if you haven't been involved and want to get involved, you can reach out to me or John Williams on our team, our general counsel, and we can get you engaged there. So those are the big items for today. Thanks, Benny, for covering the big topic of subrecipient monitoring. Next week we'll get also into the recipient, prime recipient reporting as well as the subrecipient reporting. So there should be some good overlap just in terms of how you all engage the entities you're sending money on to. But with that, Lee, I think we are good to wrap up and maybe transition into some Q&A or office hours as needed.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Benny. Thanks, everybody, as always, for being on the call. This is the portion where we've concluded our agenda. If you have questions of any kind for the NCPRO team,